Welcome to the video. Today we are going to be reading a story, but first we are going to be reading the Bible, then we are going to be doing synopsis, then we are going to be...
Ran out of breath.
And actually I did that all wrong. First we are going to be doing devotions with Daniel, then we are going to be doing the Bible, then we are going to be doing the synopsis with Kimberly, and finally we are going to be doing Fellowship of the Ring. I hope you guys enjoy. Make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and the bell notifications in the video. My words are Mississippiing.
What's Mississippiing?
Mississippiing.
And here's Daniel for Devotions with Daniel.
Okay, so we're reading about your daily journey with God by David Jeremiah. Made by Tyndale. Okay. May 24, bunkers and boulders, in the shadow of your wings I will make my refuge, until these calamities have passed by. Residents of Washington, D.C. were surprised in 1942 when workers started building the East Wing of the White House. During World War II, it was thought that the nation's energies should be expanded on the war effort, not on enlarging the presidential residence. Only a few people knew that the East Wing was being enlarged to hide the construction of an underground bunker called the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. Originally built for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, it was designed to withstand a nuclear blast in the event of an incoming intercontinental ballistic missile. In the days of David, a cave provided similar protection. While running from the armies of King Saul, David frequently found caves to be secret and secure hiding places. According to the superscription at the beginning of Psalm 57, David was hiding in such a cave when he wrote, "In the shadow of your wings I will make my refuge." Verse 1. Everyone needs a hiding place, but our security is not found in bunkers or boulders. We find refuge under the wings of the Lord. He himself is our safety. He alone is our hiding place. Under his wings my soul shall abide, safely abide forever. William O. Cushing.
Hello! So we are actually almost there in 1 Samuel, where David is going to be hiding in those... Whoa, I froze. In those caves that Daniel just talked to us about. So, but it's not going to happen in this chapter. This chapter is maybe the most famous chapter in 1 Samuel. Maybe the most famous chapter in all of the history literature from the Old Testament. So, but it is kind of a long one, so let's go ahead and get started. This is the English Standard Version. This is 1 Samuel chapter 17. Let me begin. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Socoh and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span, which I have a note in my Bible. It says 9.5 feet tall. I don't know if that is an accurate measurement, but close enough. Taller than me, that's for sure. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And the shield-bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle, and the names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and next to him Aminadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening. And Jesse said to David his son, "Take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the commander of their 1,000. See if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them." Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistine. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper and took the provisions and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment at the host as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, and ran to the ranks, and went and greeted his brothers. And he talked with them. Behold, the champion, or as he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he will come up to defy Israel, and the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel." And David said to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" And the people answered him in the same way, "So shall it be done to the man who kills him." Now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, "Why have you come down, and with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." And David said, "What have I done now? Was it not but a word?" And he turned away from him toward another, and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and When there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, The Lord has delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, and will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, Go, and the Lord be with you. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor, and he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield-bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, but the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. When the Philistine rose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine, and took his sword, and drew it out of its sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath at the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Sharaim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. As soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, As your soul lives, O king, I do not know. And the king said, Inquire whose son the boy is. And as soon as David returned from the striking down of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, Whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. So, there are 2 things that I know that was a long chapter, but there are 2 things that I want to just very quickly mention here. First of all, 3 things. So first of all, in verses 28 through, I think it was around 30 or so, there was a little bit of sibling rivalry going on here. So David is, talking like, who is this uncircumcised Philistine? And then his older brother comes up and says, hey, you don't need to be talking like that. we're professional soldiers and you're a shepherd, go watch the sheep. And so David could have taken offense to that, but I think he went on and followed what the Lord had him to do. Second, Saul offered David his armor, and David rejected it. That it might come in to be important later on in the story. And then thirdly, I thought it was very peculiar that Saul doesn't know who David is, when in just the last chapter we read, or was it the last chapter or the one before, where we read that David was in Saul's service playing the lyre whenever Saul had the spirit that tormented him. So it's possible that it's out of order because, but I don't think it is. And so it's confusing to me how that could be. Anyway, I don't have answers for any of these, except I think that there's actually something to be said about David giving up Saul's armor. And we'll probably talk about that I think it's exactly the next chapter. In fact, it is the very next chapter, when David actually accepts Jonathan's armor. And we'll talk about that one tomorrow. But this sibling rivalry right here is something that could be studied, and maybe we could learn a lesson about getting along in our family. So, just some thoughts that I had when I was reading it. So now we are on the time when I get to tell you what just happened. So they're in the darkness, and they're in Moria, and they let's see. Oh right. So they find Balin. And so Balin is so happy to see them that he just jumps for joy and welcomes them into their home. And so they live there forever, and the ring is safe, and nobody ever comes to get it. The end. They live happily ever after. Now, Kimberly is here to say what really happened.
For real, Dad?
There are no happy endings in this book.
That's
Nope.
actually true.
Not till the end, anyway, of the third book. Actually, the fourth.
Okay.
So what actually happened is they're going through the dark. Bill the pony ran away when they entered, and there was like some tentacle squid monster. And so they go in and they're going through the dark and everything, and Gandalf, he had his staff, and his staff lights up or something. He has some sort of magic light. Like, you know in Harry Potter how they do Lumos? It was kind of like that.
I think he just had a battery pack
What about
attached to
the
his
entrance?
staff.
For real, Dad?
Kim,
Yeah.
what about at the entrance?
I'm getting there. Hang on. They go over through the entrance and everything, and it's all dark, like I said, and they head toward this it's like a triple passageway, and all along Frodo, he thinks he hears a second pair of steps that's following them. That's not an echo. And so they go to this three-way door split, and they decide to wait the night. And I think it was Sam. It was Sam, right?
You're telling the story. I don't want to.
Okay. I think it was Sam. He threw a stone down a well.
No, that was Pippin.
Oh.
Yeah, Pippin.
Yeah,
And-
because Gandalf says, "Fool of a took."
Yeah. And so then they go down it was the one on the side, one of the side ones, not the middle. And I think it was the one that went up. Yeah. And then they go into this really big area, and it actually has like, it's like this really big cavern, and it has these holes drilled into the ceiling that go all the way up to, all the way through the mountain to daylight. So it's like, lit in daytime. So they, sleep the night, and then they see the shafts of light in the daytime, and, they actually found, Balin's grave. It was Balin, right?
Yeah.
He had
Or
died.
Balin, or however you say it, yeah.
Fallen from the earth.
Yeah. Yeah, it is Balin, the dwarf from the Hobbit, and they actually explained that earlier in the story, how there were 3 dwarves that didn't live under the mountain anymore, but that hadn't died, and so that's who it was, Balin and 2 of the others. I think it was Owen and Glowin, not Glowin, Owen and another one, and they explained all that back when they were in Rivendell or
Right.
something. It was
And-
kind of a side story.
Yeah, and it practically ended at that point.
Because Tolkien never tells side stories, but just that one instance he did. So
I'm going to hand it off to Dad.
Wait. What greeted them at the entrance, though?
the squid thing.
I thought it was like a ton of arms and stuff.
Yeah,
It was
Well-
like a weird tentacle thing.
tentacle thing.
It described the tentacles as arms, though.
Okay. All right. So that's where we are. And now we will continue. We are reading. This is, I have to say, one of the most iconic scenes in the entire series. I'm not saying that it is the most iconic, and if you like other scenes, obviously you're entitled to your opinion. This is one of my favorites, and I hope that you like it as well. So, Chapter 5, The Bridge of Khazad-dûm, or as Daniel said earlier today, The Bridge of Cara-dûn. No?
He did, I heard him.
Yeah, he did. Okay. So, but that's not what it's called. It is the Bridge of Khazad-dûm. The company of the Ring stood silent beside the tomb of Balin. Frodo thought of Bilbo and his long friendship with the dwarf, and of Balin's visit to the Shire long ago. In that dusty chamber in the mountains it seemed 1,000 years ago, and on the other side of the world. At length they stirred and looked up and began to search for anything that would give them tidings of Balin's fate, to show what had become of his folk. There was another smaller door on the other side of the chamber under the shaft. By both the doors they could now see that many bones were lying, and among them were broken swords and axe heads and cloven shields and helms. Some of the swords were crooked orc scimitars with blackened blades. There were many recesses cut in the rock of the walls, and in them were large iron-bound chests of wood. All had been broken and plundered, but beside the shattered lid of one there lay the remains of a book. It had been slashed and stabbed and partly burned, and it was so stained with black and other dark marks, like old blood, that little of it could be read. Gandalf lifted it carefully, but the leaves crackled and broke as he laid it on the slab. He pored over it for some time without speaking. Frodo and Gimli, standing at his side, could see as he gingerly turned the leaves that they were written by many different hands, in runes both of Moria and of Dale, and here and there in Elvish script. At last Gandalf looked up. "It seems to be a record of the fortunes of Balin's folk," he said. "I guess that it began with their coming to Dimril Dale nigh on 30 years ago. The pages seem to have numbers referring to the years after their arrival. The top page is marked 1, 3, so at least 2 are missing from the beginning. Listen to this. We drove out orcs from the great gate and guard. I think the next word is blurred and burned, probably room. We slew many in the bright, I think, sun in the dale. Floy was killed by an arrow. He slew the great. Then there is a blur, followed by Flowy under grass near Mirumer. The next line or two I cannot read. Then comes, we have taken the 21st hall of North End to dwell in. There is, I cannot read what, a shaft is mentioned. Then Balin has set up his seat in the chamber of Mazarbul. The chamber of records, said Gimli. I guess that is where we now stand. Well, I can read no more for a long way, said Gandalf, except the word gold, and Durin's axe, and something helm. Then Balin is now Lord of Moria. That seems to end a chapter. After some stars, another hand begins, and I can see we found true silver, and later the word well forged, and then something, I have it, mithril, and the last two lines, Owen to seek for the upper armories of Third Deep, something go westward, a blur to Holland Gate. Gandalf paused and set a few leaves aside. There are several pages of the same sort, rather hastily written and much damaged, he said, but I can make little of them in this light. Now there must be a number of leaves missing, because they begin to be numbered 5. The 5th year of the colony, I suppose. Let me see. No, they are too cut and stained. I cannot read them. We might do better in the sunlight. Wait, here is something, a large, bold hand using an elvish script. That would be Ori's hand, said Gimli, looking over the wizard's arm. He could write well and speedily, and often use the elvish characters. I fear he had ill tidings to recover in a fair hand, said Gandalf. The first clear word is sorrow, but the rest of the line is lost, unless it ends in estre. Yes, it must be yestre, followed by day before the 10th of November, Balin, Lord of Moria, fell in Dimril Dale. He went alone to look in Miromer, and an orc shot him from behind a stone. We slew the orc, but many more up from the east, up the Silver Lode. The remainder of the page is so blurred that I can hardly make anything out. But I think I can read. We have barred the gates, and then can hold them long if... and then perhaps horrible and suffer. Poor Balin. He seems to have kept the title that he took for less than 5 years. I wonder what happened afterward, but there is no time to puzzle out the last few pages. Here is the last page of all. He paused and sighed. It is grim reading, he said. I fear their end was cruel. Listen. We cannot get out. We cannot get out. They have taken the bridge in Second Hall. Fear and Loney and Naley fell there. Frar and Loney and Naley fell there. Then there are 4 lines smeared so that I can only read, went 5 days ago. The last line runs, the pool is up to the wall at West Gate. The watcher in the water took Owen. We cannot get out. The end comes, then drums. Drums in the deep. I wonder what that means. The last thing written is in a trailing scrawl of elf letters. They are coming. There is nothing more. Gandalf paused and stood in silent thought. A sudden dread and a horror of the chamber fell on the company. We cannot get out, muttered Gimli. It was well for us that the pool had sunk a little, and that the watcher was sleeping down at the southern end. Gandalf raised his head and looked round. They seem to have made a last stand by both doors, he said, but there were not many left by that time. So ended the attempt to retake Moria. It was valiant, but foolish. The time is not yet come. Now I fear we must say farewell to Balin, son of Fundin. Here he must lie in the halls of his fathers. We will take this book, the book of Marzarbul, and look at it more closely later. You had better keep it, Gimli, and take it back to Dain if you get a chance. It will interest him, though it will grieve him deeply. Come, let us go. The morning is passing. Which way shall we go? Asked Boromir. Back to the hall, answered Gandalf. But our visit to this room has not been in vain. I now know where we are. This must be, as Gimli says, the chamber of Marzarbul, and the hall must be the 21st of the north end. Therefore we should leave by the eastern arch of the hall, and bear right and south, and go downwards. The 21st hall should be on the 7th level. That is 6 above the level of the gates. Come now, back to the hall. Gandalf had hardly spoken these words when there came a great noise, a rolling boom that seemed to come from depths far below, and to tremble in the stone at their feet. They sprang toward the door in alarm. Doom! Doom! It rolled again, as if huge hands were turning the very caverns of Moria into a vast drum. Then there came an echoing blast. A great horn was blown in the hall, and answering horns and harsh cries were heard further off. There was a hurrying sound of many feet. They are coming, cried Legolas. We cannot get out, said Gimli. Trapped, cried Gandalf. Why did I delay? Here we are, caught just as they were before. But I was not here then. We will see what... Doom! Doom! Came the drumbeat, and the walls shook. Slam the doors and wedge them, shouted Aragorn, and keep your packs on as long as you can. We may get a chance to cut our way out yet. No, said Gandalf. We must not get shut in. Keep the east door ajar. We will go out that way if we get the chance. Another harsh horn call, and shrill cries rang out. Feet were coming down the corridor. There was a ring and clatter as the company drew their swords. Glamdrings shone with a pale light, and Sting glinted at the edges. Boromir set his shoulder against the western door. Wait a moment. Do not close it yet, said Gandalf. He sprang forward to Boromir's side and drew himself up to its full height. To his full height. Who comes hither to disturb the rest of Balin, Lord of Moria? He cried in a loud voice. There was a rush of hoarse laughter like the fall of sliding stones into a pit, and amid the clamor a deep voice was raised in command. Doom! Boom! Doom! Went the drums in the deep. With a quick movement, Gandalf stepped before the narrow opening of the door and thrust forward his staff. There was a dazzling flash that lit the chamber and the passage outside. For an instant the wizard looked out. Arrows whined and whistled down the corridor as he sprang back. There are orcs, very many of them, he said, and some are large and evil, black Uruks of Mordor. For the moment they are hanging back, but there is something else there. A great cave troll, I think, or more than one. There is no hope of escape that way. And no hope at all if they come at the other door as well, said Boromir. There is no sound outside here yet, said Aragorn, who was standing by the eastern door listening. The passage on this side plunges straight down a stair. It plainly does not lead back toward the hall, but it is no good flying blindly this way with the pursuit just behind. We cannot block the door. The key is gone, and the lock is broken, and it opens inwards. We must do something to delay the enemy first. We will make them fear the chamber of Marzarbul, he said grimly, feeling the edge of his sword, Anduril. Heavy feet were heard in the corridor. Boromir flung himself against the door and heaved it to. Then he wedged it with broken sword blades and splinters of wood. The company retreated to the other side of the chamber, but they had no chance to fly yet. There was a blow on the door that made it quiver, and then it began to grind slowly open, driving back the wedges. A huge arm and a shoulder with a dark skin of greenish scales was thrust through the widening gap. Then a great flat toeless foot was forced through below. There was a dead silence outside. Boromir leapt forward and hewed at the arm with all his might, but his sword glanced aside, and fell from the shaken hand. The blade was notched. Suddenly, and to his own surprise, Frodo felt a hot wrath blaze up in his heart. "The Shire!" he cried, and springing beside Boromir, he stooped and stabbed with sting at the hideous foot. There was a bellow, and the foot jerked back, nearly wrenching Sting from Frodo's arm. Black drops dripped from the blade and smoked on the floor. Boromir hurled himself against the door and slammed it again. "One for the Shire!" cried Aragorn. "The hobbit's bite is deep. You have a good blade, Frodo, son of Drogo." There was a crash on the door, followed by crash after crash. Rams and hammers were beating against it. It cracked and staggered back, and the opening grew suddenly wide. Arrows came whistling in, but struck the northern wall and fell harmlessly to the floor. There was a horn blast and a rush of feet, and orcs, one after another, leapt into the chamber. How many there were, the company could not count. The affray was sharp, but the orcs were dismayed by the fierceness of the defense. Legolas shot two through the throat. Gimli hewed the legs from under another that had sprung up on Balin's tomb. Boromir and Aragorn slew many. When 13 had fallen, the rest fled shrieking, leaving the defenders unharmed except for Sam, who had a scratch along the scalp. A quick duck had saved him, and he had felled his orc. A sturdy thrust with his barrow blade. A fire was smoldering in his brown eyes that would have made Ted Sandyman step backward if he had seen it. "Now is the time," cried Gandalf. "Let us go before the troll returns." But even as they retreated, and before Pippin and Merry had reached the stair outside, a huge orc chieftain, almost man-high, clad in black mail from head to foot, leapt into the chamber behind his followers clustered in the doorway. His broad, flat face was swart, his eyes were like coals, and his tongue was red. He wielded a great spear. With a thrust of his huge hide shield, he turned Boromir's sword and bore him backward, throwing him to the ground. Diving under Aragorn's blow with the speed of a striking snake, he charged into the company and thrust with his spear straight at Frodo. The blow caught him on the right side, and Frodo was hurled against the wall and pinned. Sam, with a cry, hacked at the spear shaft, and it broke. But even as the orc flung down the truncheon and swept out his scimitar, Anduril came down upon his helm. What is going on? Okay, I will try to pick up where I was. Are we good? Mm-hmm. All right. Aragorn picked up... Is that where we were? No, we hadn't gotten there.
I remember the last word you said was home.
Okay, that's great. Diving under Aragorn's blow with the speed of a striking snake, he charged into the company and thrust with his spear straight at Frodo. The blow caught him on the right side, and Frodo was hurled against the wall and pinned. Sam, with a cry, hacked at the spear shaft, and it broke. But even as the orc flung down the truncheon and swept out his scimitar, Anduril came down upon his helm. There was a flash like flame, and the helm burst asunder. The orc fell with cloven head. His followers fled howling as Boromir and Aragorn sprang at them. "Doom, doom!" went the drums in the deep. The great voice rolled out again. "Now!" shouted Gandalf. "Now is the last chance! Run for it!" Aragorn picked up Frodo where he lay by the wall and made for the stair, pushing Merry and Pippin in front of him. The others followed, but Gimli had had to be dragged away by Legolas. In spite of the peril, he lingered by Balin's tomb with his head bowed. Boromir hauled the eastern door to, grinding upon its hinges. It had great iron rings on either side, but could not be fastened. "I'm all right," gasped Frodo. "I can walk. Put me down." Aragorn nearly dropped him in amazement. "I thought you were dead," he cried. "Not yet," said Gandalf, "but there is no time for wonder. Off you go, all of you, down the stairs. Wait a few minutes for me at the bottom, but if I do not come soon, go on. Go quickly and choose paths leading right and downward." "We cannot leave you to hold the door alone," said Aragorn. "Do as I say," said Gandalf fiercely. "Swords are no more use here. Go!" The passage was lit by no shaft and was utterly dark. They groped their way down a long flight of steps and then looked back, but they could see nothing except high above them the faint glimmer of the wizard's staff. He seemed to be still standing on guard by the closed door. Frodo breathed heavily and leaned against Sam, who put his arms about him. They stood peering up the stair into the darkness. Frodo thought he could hear the voice of Gandalf above, muttering words that ran down the sloping roof with a sighing echo. He could not catch what was said. The walls seemed to be trembling. Every now and again the drum beats throbbed and rolled. Doom! Doom! Suddenly at the top of the stair there was a stab of white light. Then there was a dull rumble and a heavy thud. The drum beats broke out wildly. Doom boom! Doom boom! And then stopped. Gandalf came flying down the steps and fell to the ground in the midst of the company. "Well, well, that's over," said the wizard, struggling to his feet. "I have done all that I could, but I have met my match, and I have nearly been destroyed. But don't stand here. Go on. You will have to do without light for a while. I am rather shaken. Go on, go on. Where are you, Gimli? Come on ahead with me. Keep close behind, all of you." They stumbled after him, wondering what had happened. Doom! Doom! Went the drum beats again. They now sounded muffled and far away, but they were following. There was no other sound of pursuit, neither tramp of feet nor any voice. Gandalf took turns, right or left, for the passage seemed to be going in the direction that he desired. Every now and again it descended a flight of steps, 50 or more, to a lower level. At the moment that was their chief danger, for in the dark they could not see a descent until they came upon it, and put their feet out into emptiness. Gandalf felt the ground with his staff like a blind man. At the end of an hour they had gone a mile, or maybe a little more, and had descended many flights of stairs. There was still no sound of pursuit. Almost they began to hope that they would escape. At the bottom of the 7th flight Gandalf halted. "It's getting hot," he gasped. "We ought to be down at least to the level of the gates now. Soon I think we should look for a left-hand turn to take us east. I hope it is not far. I am very weary. I must rest here a moment, even if all the orcs ever spawned are after us." Gimli took his arm and helped him down to a seat on the step. "What happened away up there at the door?" he asked. "Did you meet the beater of the drums?" "I do not know," answered Gandalf, "but I found myself suddenly faced by something that I had not met before. I could think of nothing to do but to try and put a shutting spell on the door. I know many, but to do things of that kind rightly requires time, and even then the door can be broken by strength. As I stood there, I could hear orc voices on the other side. At any moment I thought they would burst it open. I could not hear what was said. They seemed to be talking in their own hideous language. All I caught was gosh, that is fire. Then something came into their chamber. I felt it through the door, and the orcs themselves were afraid and fell silent. It laid hold of the iron ring, and then it perceived me and my spell. What it was I cannot guess, but I have never felt such a challenge. The counterspell was terrible. It nearly broke me. For an instant the door left my control and began to open. I had to speak a word of command. That proved too great a strain. The door burst into pieces. Something dark as a cloud was blocking out all the light inside, and I was thrown backward down the stairs. All the wall gave way, and the roof of the chamber as well, I think. I am afraid Balin is buried deep, and maybe something else is buried there too. I cannot say, but at least the passage behind us was completely blocked. Ah, I have never felt so spent, but it is passing. And now what about you, Frodo? There was not time to say so, but I have never been more delighted in my life than when you spoke. I feared that it was a brave but dead hobbit Aragorn was carrying. What about me? Said Frodo. I am alive and whole, I think. I am bruised and in pain, but it's not too bad. Well, said Aragorn, I can only say that hobbits are made of stuff so tough that I have never met the like of it. Had I known, I would have spoken softer in the inn at Bree. That spear thrust would have skewered a wild boar. Well, it did not skewer me, I am glad to say, said Frodo, though I feel as if I had been caught between a hammer and an anvil. He said no more. He found breathing painful. You take after Bilbo, said Gandalf. There is more about you than meets the eye, as I said of him long ago. Frodo wondered if the remark meant more than it said. They now went on. Before long, Gimli spoke. He had keen eyes in the dark. I think, he said, that there is a light ahead, but it is not daylight. It is red. What can it be? Gimli, muttered Gandalf, I wonder if that is what they meant, that the lower levels are on fire. Still, we can only go on. Soon the light became unmistakable and could be seen by all. It was flickering and glowing on the walls away down the passage before them. They could now see their way. In front the road sloped down swiftly, and some way ahead there stood a low archway. Through it the growing light came. The air became very hot. When they came to the arch, Gandalf went through, signing to them to wait. As he stood just beyond the opening, they saw his face lit by a red glow. Quickly he stepped back. There is some new devilry here, he said, devised for our welcome, no doubt. But I know now where we are. We have reached the first deep, the level immediately below the gates. This is the second hall of Old Moria, and the gates are near, away beyond the eastern end on the left, not more than a quarter of a mile across the bridge, up the broad stair, along a wide road, through the first hall, and out. But come and look. They peered out. Before them was another cavernous hall. It was loftier and far longer than the one in which they had slept. They were near its eastern end. Westward it ran away into darkness. Down the center stalked a double line of towering pillars. They were carved like boles of mighty trees with boughs upheld, whose boughs upheld the roof with a branching tracery of stone. Their stems were smooth and black, but a red glow was darkly mirrored in the sides. Right across the floor, close to the feet of two huge pillars, a great fissure had opened. Out of it a fierce red light came, and now and again flames licked at the brink and curled about the bases of the columns. Wisps of dark smoke wavered in the hot air. If we had come by the main road down from the upper halls, we should have been trapped here, said Gandalf. Let us hope that the fire now lies between us and pursuit. Come, there is no time to lose. Even as he spoke, they heard again the pursuing drumbeat. Doom, doom, doom! Away beyond the shadows, at the western end of the hall, there came cries and horn calls. Doom, doom! The pillars seemed to tremble, and the flames to quiver. Now for the last race, said Gandalf. If the sun is shining outside, we may still escape. After me! He turned left and sped across the smooth floor of the hall. The distance was greater than it had looked. As they ran, they heard the beat and echo of many hurrying feet behind. A shrill yell went up. They had been seen. There was a ring and a clash of steel. An arrow whistled over Frodo's head. Boromir laughed. "They did not expect this," he said. "The fire has cut them off. We are on the wrong side." "Look ahead," called Gandalf. "The bridge is near. It is dangerous and narrow." Suddenly Frodo saw before him a black chasm. At the end of the hall, the floor vanished and fell to an unknown depth. The outer door could only be reached by a slender bridge of stone without curb or rail that spanned the chasm with one curving spring of 50 feet. It was an ancient defense of the dwarves against any enemy that might capture the first hall and the outer passage. They could only pass across it in single file. At the brink, Gandalf halted, and the others came up in a pack behind. "Lead the way, Gimli," he said. "Pippin and Merry next. Straight on and up the stair beyond the door." Arrows fell among them. One struck Frodo and sprang back. Another pierced Gandalf's hat and stuck there like a black feather. Frodo looked behind. Beyond the fire he saw swarming black figures. There seemed to be hundreds of orcs. They brandished spears and scimitars which shone red as blood in the firelight. "Doom! Doom!" rolled the drumbeats, growing louder and louder. "Doom! Doom!" Legolas turned and set an arrow to the string, though it was a long shot for his small bow. He drew, but his hand fell, and the arrow slipped to the ground. He gave a cry of dismay and fear. 2 great trolls appeared. They bore great slabs of stone and flung them down to serve as gangways over the fire. But it was not the trolls that had filled the elf with terror. The ranks of the orcs had opened, and they crowded away as if they themselves were afraid. Something was coming up behind them. What it was could not be seen. It was like a great shadow, in the middle of which was a dark form, of man shape maybe, yet greater, and a power and terror seemed to be in it, and to go before it. It came to the edge of the fire, and the light faded, as if a cloud had bent over it. Then, with a rush, it leapt across the fissure. The flames roared up to greet it, and wreathed about it, and a black smoke swirled in the air. Its streaming mane kindled and blazed behind it. In its right hand was a blade like a stabbing tongue of fire. In its left it held a whip of many thongs. "Aye, aye," wailed Legolas. "A Balrog! A Balrog is come!" Gimli stared with wide eyes. "Durin's bane!" he cried, and letting his axe fall, he covered his face. "A Balrog!" muttered Gandalf. "Now I understand." He faltered and leaned heavily on his staff. "What an evil fortune! And I am already weary!" The dark figure, streaming with fire, raced towards them. The orcs yelled and poured over the stone gangways. Then Boromir raised his horn and blew. Loud the challenge rang and bellowed like the shout of many throats under the cavernous roof. For a moment the orcs quailed and the fiery shadow halted. Then the echoes died as suddenly as a flame blown out by a dark wind, and the enemy advanced again. "Over the bridge!" cried Gandalf, recalling his strength. "Fly! This is a foe beyond any of you! I must hold the narrow way! Fly!" Aragorn and Boromir did not heed the command, but still held their ground side by side, behind Gandalf at the far end of the bridge. The others halted just within the doorway at the hall's end, and turned, unable to leave their leader to face the enemy alone. The Balrog reached the bridge. Gandalf stood in the middle of the span, leaning on the staff in his left hand, but in his other hand Glamdring gleamed, cold and white. His enemy halted again, facing him, and the shadow about it reached out like 2 vast wings. It raised the whip, and the thongs whined and cracked. Fire came from its nostrils, but Gandalf stood firm. "You cannot pass!" he said. The orcs stood still, and a dead silence fell. "I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor. You cannot pass! The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Uden. Go back to the shadow! You cannot pass!" The Balrog made no answer. The fire in it seemed to die, but the darkness grew. It stepped forward slowly onto the bridge, and suddenly it drew itself up to a great height, and its wings were spread from wall to wall, but still Gandalf could be seen, glimmering in the gloom. He seemed small and altogether alone, grey and bent like a wizened tree before the onset of a storm. From out of the shadow a red sword leapt, flaming. Glamdring glittered white in answer. There was a ringing clash and a stab of white fire. The Balrog fell back, and its sword flew up in molten fragments. The wizard swayed on the bridge, stepped back a pace, and then again stood still. "You cannot pass!" he said. With a bound the Balrog leapt full upon the bridge. Its whip whirled and hissed. "He cannot stand alone!" cried Aragorn suddenly, and ran back along the bridge. "Elendil!" he shouted. "I am with you, Gandalf!" "Gondor!" cried Boromir, and leapt after him. At that moment Gandalf lifted his staff, and crying aloud, he smote the bridge before him. The staff broke asunder and fell from his hand. A blinding sheet of white flame sprang up. The bridge cracked. Right at the Balrog's feet it broke, and the stone upon which it stood crashed into the gulf, while the rest remained poised, quivering like a tongue of rock, thrust out into emptiness. With a terrible cry, the Balrog fell forward, and its shadow plunged down and vanished. But even as it fell, it swung its whip, and the thongs lashed and curled about the wizard's knees, dragging him to the brink. He staggered and fell, grasped vainly at the stone, and slid into the abyss. "Fly, you fools!" he cried, and was gone. The fires went out, and blank darkness fell. The company stood rooted with horror, staring into the pit. Even as Aragorn and Boromir came flying back, the rest of the bridge cracked and fell. With a cry, Aragorn roused them. "Come, I will lead you now," he called. "We must obey his last command. Follow me." They stumbled wildly up the great stairs beyond the door, Aragorn leading, Boromir at the rear. At the top was a wide, echoing passage. Along this they fled. Frodo heard Sam at his side weeping, and then he found that he himself was weeping as he ran. "Doom! Doom! Doom!" The drumbeats rolled behind, mournful now and slow. "Doom!" They ran on. The light grew before them. Great shafts pierced the roof. They ran swifter. They passed into the hall, bright with daylight from its high windows in the east. They fled across it. Through its huge broken doors they passed, and suddenly before them the great gates opened, an arch of blazing light. There was a guard of orcs crouching in the shadows behind the great doorposts towering on either side, but the gates were shattered and cast down. Aragorn smote to the ground the captain that stood in his path, and the rest fled in terror of his wrath. The company swept past them and took no heed of them. Out of the gates they ran and sprang down the huge and age-worn steps, the threshold of Moria. Thus at last they came beyond hope under the sky, and felt the wind on their faces. They did not halt until they were out of bowshot from the walls. Dimrill Dale lay about them. The shadow of the misty mountains lay upon it, but eastward there was a golden light on the land. It was but 1 hour after noon. The sun was shining, the clouds were white and high. They looked back. Dark yawned the archway of the gates under the mountain shadow. Faint and far beneath the earth rolled the slow drum beats. Doom! A thin black smoke trailed out. Nothing else was to be seen. The dale all around was empty. Doom! Grief at last wholly overcame them, and they wept long, some standing and silent, some cast upon the ground. Doom! Doom! The drum beats faded. And that is the end of chapter 5. I hope that you did not enjoy the end of Gandalf the Grey. And we will have to continue tomorrow with chapter 6, which is called Lothlorien. And the first word is appropriately alas. So, we will see you again tomorrow when we get to read that chapter. And God bless you. Have a great evening, and we'll see you again.